Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is a bonus episode about an online game to reduce polarization. Our political landscape is fractured. Misinformation runs rampant, fueling hostility and division. Political violence fears run high, often fueled by distorted perceptions. Here's Stanford sociology professor Rob Willer.
These interventions that kind of try to pop that bubble and say, actually, you're really overestimating how much the voters on the other side support these undemocratic moves and support democratic backsliding on their side. That's actually not that popular. You're overestimating that maybe twofold, or in the case of violence, 3 or 4-fold. And getting that information was helpful for ratcheting things down. But the converse of that is that in the absence of that corrective information, people just are going to likely go up and up and up in their partisan animosities and their willingness to forsake democratic principles. And so all this could start with a narrative that worries people, gets them to consume more news, but then it can make itself real. And this is one of the dynamics that I get really concerned about. I worry about contributing to that dynamic by shining a light on these problems. You don't want to do it in such a way that you're exaggerating these perceptions.
And that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and on this episode we're joined by a researcher who's developed a game that's not only fun, but actually reduces political polarization and fosters empathy across the aisle.
Hi everyone, I am Ashwin Rajadesingan. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the Communication Studies department, and my research is generally on how we can get Republicans and Democrats to have reasonable political discussions online, and how we can reduce hostility online, offline. So I'm excited to talk more about my work here.
We'll dive into the science behind the game, explore its surprising results, and discuss what it means for the future of civil discourse. So buckle up, because we're about to embark on a journey where games, psychology, and the future of democracy collide. Don't miss this fascinating conversation, coming right now. Well, welcome to the show, Ashwin, and thank you for making the time.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So let's start by telling listeners about the game and try to make it sound fun.
Yeah, so GuesSync is, if you played Family Feud, or if you've seen Family Feud, it's kind of similar to that, but in an online context. This research kind of came out of the pandemic pretty much, where it was all cool to be on Zoom and play games with your family. And so how this game works is, and it's live now. You can go and play it. It's called GuesSync.com. So GuesSync.com. And so how the game works is, when you get into the site, you are randomly matched up with someone else on the site at that time, and you go through the game. There are multiple rounds in the game, and in each round you're given a specific question. So, for example, this question could be like, what percentage of Americans have seen the movie Titanic, right? And then you have to work with your teammate, and with some certain clues, figure out what that answer is, right? But sometimes some of these questions may also be political. For example, what percentage of Republicans support background checks for gun sales in like private gun sales or gun shows, right? And so some of these questions are political, some of these are non-political, casual. And so the idea here is to come up with like a casual low stakes, fun game that incidentally corrects misperceptions that people have about the other side. And so we ran an experiment with about 700 or 650 odd participants, and we found that the game was effective in reducing hostility towards Democrats, not as much. I mean, hostility for Democrats, that is towards Republicans, but not the other way around. But also the game was effective in increasing willingness to talk to the other side about politics, which is something that we're really looking forward to do. Like, I think the one of the main problems here right now in the US is that people don't really like talking politics with the other side. I mean, for good reason too, oftentimes. So we're excited about some of these results that we've got and looking to move forward with providing more games. And I think the more satisfying kind of result was also that people found the game that contains political content to be just as fun as games that did not compared to a control version of the game that did not have any political content in it. So it kind of gives us like encouragement in some ways to mix politics and play, which I think in the past people haven't really tried out, right? So yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of the second aspect of that, the willingness to speak to each other, did that apply to both Democrats and Republicans?
So it applied to Democrats and Republicans, but the Republicans' data it wasn't what we call statistically significant. So I wouldn't be confident in saying that it would apply to Republicans, but on the whole, we see kind of similar direction there.
So I wasn't gonna go there first, but since it's sort of come up, I will. So you talk a little bit in the paper about some of your ideas of why that might be the case. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about why you didn't observe that same effect for Republican players, and what you think that might mean for sort of, this podcast is about lowering the temperature. So, I mean, is it possible to lower the temperature if only one side is less hostile towards the out party members?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think there were multiple factors. So, I mean, the game tries to reduce hostility by reducing misperceptions, right? And so one reason for why we didn't see as much movement on the Republican side is because, in general, Republicans in our study seem to be more moderate than Republicans nationally. So if you were to compare, say, the percentage of Republicans who claim to be weak Republicans, that is weakly aligned, I think the percentage was about 40% in our data set, in our study, versus I think about 25% nationally. So which means that on average, the Republicans who played the game were more moderate. And so when they are more moderate, it also means that they harbor fewer misperceptions, and which means that there's lesser things to correct. Right. So that was one reason, a significant reason. The other reason, I think, was also the kind of questions that we'd selected in the game itself for Republicans. So we'd selected questions based on like a pre-test kind of survey that we'd done before to identify issues that there were most misperceptions on. But we didn't account for the direction of misperception. So, for example, with Democrats, we found that Democrats seem to find misperceive Republicans to be more conservative than they actually are based on the questions that we had provided. Whereas for Republicans, that wasn't as much the case. Like they in fact were on point with where Democrats already were in terms of their policy views. So again, there wasn't as much correction to be made there.
Right. So a bit of it is the Republicans didn't have as far to move in your, at least the ones participating in the study, and then moving the Democrats just sort of brought it to a more level playing field.
Yeah.
Would that be a reasonable way to look at it? Yeah. So that's actually pretty cool. So were there any other surprises in your findings from this project?
Yeah, I think for us, the biggest surprise was people took to the game pretty well. I think so. In the experiment, we came up with three versions of the game. So one is a non-political version where there weren't any kinds of misperception correcting information there. But then we had two what we call treatment versions. So in one version of the game, out of 5 rounds, only two were political. So political questions were asked in 2 out of the 5 rounds, whereas in another version of the game, all 5 rounds were political rounds. So it was like a fully political version of the game versus a mixed political version of the game versus no political version. And what was very surprising for us was all three versions of the game scored kind of identical numbers in terms of whether the players would recommend the game to anyone else, whether they had fun, whether they found the answers surprising. And I think that is a good thing. Oftentimes when we unfortunately, when we talk about politics, it's heated, and emotions get kind of the better of us. But to actually see like content like this being described as fun, I think there's something there that I'm hopeful we can kind of tap into in the future.
Yeah, and I didn't know that you had already sort of put out a more public version of it, and so that's one of the factors of scaling up. Scaling up is always, something the skeptics sort of say about these kinds of projects, that they won't scale up, but maybe this one has that opportunity to do so.
Yeah. I think that's the major kind of contribution in this study, I feel. There's a lot of social political science research that kind of has given us some strategies that we can use to reduce effective polarization, right? But it's all done in more survey settings, and so a major strategy that researchers have found out is correcting misperceptions of the other side. But then how do we do this at scale? So one option could be you convince the powers that be at Facebook and Twitter and these social media companies to tweak their algorithms to reduce exposure to extreme people on social media, because that leads to misperceptions about the other side. But we all know how hard that is to convince these big companies to do that. Another option would be in terms of influencing news media to not cover these extreme partisans all the time, which again is a harder task to do. That's one of the reasons why I think scaling up has been difficult. And so we've come up with, I would say, a pretty unorthodox solution. So I'd see this as a test case, right? So can we make this information about this misperception correcting information fun enough and kind of innocuous enough that people kind of adopt this misperception correcting intervention in kind of their everyday lives, either through games or through other kind of forms, more casual interactive forms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with the game, you're working on those misperceptions, which about the sort of opponents and their views of their opponents, and which has, as you noted, is one of the things people have identified. A lot of studies have identified is pretty effective at lowering the temperature. But you also mentioned this idea that you're not using this for sort of correcting factual beliefs, which seem to be maybe a little more moral attachment to those. It might be harder to change. I mean, have you tested that, or are you considering testing that idea?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think the the design choice to choose these kinds of beliefs is that I feel like these are easier to change, right? Because no one knows, like as a lay person, you don't know what this you don't know what your own side thinks about certain things, to be fair. But thinking about what the other side thinks is a quite a bridge to cross, right? So you don't know that at all, and so that kind of degree of uncertainty is something I feel like we can tap into, and hopefully that'll help correcting. I mean, hopefully the game helps in correcting that kind of misperception, which is, I think, slightly less.
There's sort of less resistance to it.
Yeah, less resistance to it. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess it's sort of one step at a time too. Especially since we like it looks promising that idea of lowering those misperceptions can have some positive effect.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Also, I think there's like also lesser pushback against it in terms of like the other party as well, like political elites. I mean, because I think political elites also have a certain agenda to. I mean, your podcast is called Outrage Overload, so a certain agenda to create that outrage, and make believe that the other side is extreme, and also in some ways be extreme themselves. That also helps mobilize voters. So I think having this kind of second degree in some ways beliefs kind of helps, I think, get at some of these issues easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And yeah, so that's cool that it's out and available, so anybody can just go to that site and play. And in the research, you must in some way have identified players as sort of Democrat or Republican in some way. But on this public one, are you somehow doing that, or are you trying to just avoid that?
No, yeah, we're trying to completely avoid that. So the way we've kind of positioned this game is that it's just a fun, casual game. It's not really meant to be political. So, I mean, I think an important point here is that the game is designed specifically in a way that you don't need to know politics to play the game. And that design choice is very deliberate, because we know that only some people are really interested in politics, and honestly, we don't want those people to really play the game, right? In some ways, we wanted to reach the wider audience who are fairly oblivious to politics in some ways. And so there's no politics, there are no political cues in the game. And because we know that once you ask someone their political affiliation, then you're cueing their identity, then there's some kind of groupthink that happens. But also the game is also, I mean, in terms of other design choices, the game is somewhat slower than the other games. I think the idea here is that if we're designing the game as a fast-paced, rapid-fire style rounds, then you're more likely to stereotype in the kinds of responses that you give. It's kind of top of the head responses, but we want people to actually think about the responses they give. So I feel like it's a well thought out game in that sense, where we're not trying to be political at all, and we're trying to like make it as fun as possible, while still providing some nuggets that are useful to people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we'll make sure to have those links in the show notes. Yeah, that's super cool. So, is there any other next steps, and how are you looking at promoting this game?
Yeah, I mean, next steps is, so this game is a two-player game where you're kind of connecting with someone else. But there's another version that we're coming up with, which is a single-player game. So two-player games are great. It's like social and fun, right? So oftentimes when people are playing this game, so we also have some chat options in the game. So people after each round they chat, and so the players, once they get the answer, they're like, "Oh my God, I never knew this," or "That's super surprising," or "Yay, amazing," right? So there's certain camaraderie that gets built into it, which is great. But it's also slightly distracting in some ways, because we want people to like kind of focus on that one thing a little bit more. And so we come up with like a single player version that we're building up. It's kind of like similar to, I mean, Wordle, kind of like Wordle, where, you know, Wordle isn't like a, it's like a subtle game, right? So you're kind of playing it on your own, and you're doing it on your phone. And then in some ways, you're also, at least back then when it was first popular, you're also thinking about strategies where, okay, what's the first word that I should put in, right? So there's some sort of personal deliberation that happens there. And we're trying to bring that out in the game as well, so that it's not just like an interaction-based thing, but there's some time for you to kind of reflect on these results, these facts as well, or beliefs. And so, in terms of trying to push this game forward, we're trying to, popularize the game by showing up on podcasts like yours. But yeah, trying to get the word out, both through the university, but also on social media. Hopefully, next time round, we'll have the game published on Facebook. Right now, it is accessible, but I think if it's inside Facebook, then it's a little more. There's going to be more people playing the game. So that's the idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, another aspect of Wordle was, there was that sort of competition side because they made that easy to share your results. So there might be a way to work into that too. Like, hey, I was only 30% off on my misperceptions. That's probably not the right idea, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, I feel like that kind of social chatting, and if you kind of are doing this on a daily basis, then that kind of also helps aid retention. And so, yeah, the next steps is coming up with this other game, but also having multiple. So right now we only have about, I would say, 40 odd questions. So it's good enough to do like 2 or 3 cycles of these games, but we're looking to build this up so that it's like a daily thing, and maybe it becomes a routine that people kind of work it into their routines. So
that's awesome. Well, I'm really, really glad you're doing this work, and it's nice to see some encouragement, because there's a lot of skepticism out there in this space, and a lot of people struggling trying to figure out what to do with it. So I'm really, this is really, really, I think our listeners will appreciate some positive momentum here, and I'm glad this worked out the way it has, and we will definitely spread the word on this as much as we can. And thank you so much for making time to come on the show.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. Our focus for 2024 is to make the best show possible, to add the most value to you, our listeners. And the best way we can keep improving on that is to hear from you. What do you like to see? What do you want to see? What would make this show more valuable for you? You can give us that feedback at outrageoverload@gmail.com. Or if you're worried about hurting my feelings, you can go directly to outrageoverload.net/survey and give those comments anonymously. So thanks again for listening, and look for a new episode in a couple of weeks.